Hello, my friends. I hope you've had a magical day so far. I know I certainly have. Today I had a very special letter arrive. Another one from Fergusson. Fergusson is my friend. Well, he's a wombat with a big personality, and he travels all across Australia. Last we met him, he was going to find a very important hat. Shall we see what he got up to? All right. Soon, Fergusson was outside the little hat shop, built into the base of a very large gum tree. That sounds fun. He opened the little door and went in. "G'day," said Fergusson, tipping his hat towards Mrs. Possum, who was standing behind the shop counter. "Like a hat, please." "Good morning, Fergusson," said Mrs. Possum. "What sort of hat do you want?" "I'm going to have my portrait painted," said Fergusson proudly. "I have just the hat," said Mrs. Possum, as she bent down into the cupboard beneath the counter. Fergusson patted a couple of stray furs back into place and admired himself in the mirror on the counter. "Here we are," said Mrs. Possum, popping a hat on his head. "That's a bowler hat," said Fergusson. "That's what English people wear, and I'm not English." "It's an important-looking hat," replied Mrs. Possum. "Well," said Fergusson, taking off the bowler hat, "it's not the sort of important hat that I want." Sounds like Fergusson and Mrs. Possum are having some difficulties understanding each other. How do you think they're going to handle this? Shall we find out? Mrs. Possum put the bowler hat back under the counter and went off to look in another cupboard. "What about this hat?" she said, offering him a nice navy blue beret. Fergusson put the beret on and admired himself in the mirror. He twirled a small piece of fur under his nose. Not bad for a French wombat, but not for me. He took off the hat and handed it back over the counter. "Well, what sort of hat are you looking for?" "I don't have a lot of hats that would fit a head as big as yours," said Mrs. Possum. "Mrs. Possum?" Fergusson puffed out his chest. "Yes, I have a fine head for a wombat." He smiled at himself in the mirror and straightened his ruffled furs. Doesn't sound like they're getting very far and communicating with each other, does it? What kind of things would you do if you were trying to get someone to help you or find something for you, but they weren't really understanding what you were looking for? I know sometimes I get upset when this happens. I just want to shout, "I told you already!" But that doesn't really help the situation, does it? One of the things that I've found really helps is if I write down a list of all the things that that object is like. For example, if I was trying to get a friend to help pick out an activity for the two of us to do, and none of the options they were making sounded good, I like for me and my friend to make a list. And it writes down all the things that we'd like to do together. So something fun, something creative, something quick, something easy to set up, and something new. And we look at our lists and see what kind of things fit into that categories. Here, Fergusson can write down what kind of things is an important hat. As we can see already with Mrs. Possum, there are lots of important hats. But this one seems very special to Fergusson. Maybe it's a big hat, it's a green hat, and it's got a bit of sparkle on it. Shall we see how Fergusson tells Mrs. Possum what he's looking for? Didn't take long until Mrs. Possum squealed with delight and hurried off to the back of the shop. "I have it," she called, scurrying in with an enormous hat in her hand. "And this one will keep the sun off too." It was a large cowboy hat. Fergusson tried it on and he looked in the mirror. It does make me look important," he thought, imagining himself as a tall, proud American martial wombat with two silver six-shooter guns in holsters hanging around his hips. It sounds a bit scary, Fergusson. Fergusson began to see himself standing in the middle of a dirt road, facing a gang of bank robbers. He pulled the 6 silver shooters out of their holsters and moved towards the bad guys. "Oh no, Fergusson." He could hear the crowd cheer as he started to spin the silver shooters in his hands until Fergusson heard someone laughing, and the sound quickly brought him back to reality. Mrs. Possum was laughing at him as she stood before the door, watching with him looking at the mirror and his fingers pointed like guns. "It's not really what I'm after," said Fergusson, quickly taking off the hat and looking very awkward. Oh dear, do we think we're going to find the right hat? Let's find out. Mrs. Possum rustled about in the cupboard again, and this time she came out with an African safari hat called a pith helmet. Fergusson grabbed the helmet and placed it on his head. He stared at himself in the mirror, this time seeing himself as a great hunter. "Yeah," he mumbled, "an important hunter wombat fighting ferocious wild animals." Suddenly, there was a big lion staring right at him, and he ripped the hat off his head as quickly as he could. Still panting with fear, feeling a little bit put off by it, Fergusson asked, "Haven't you got anything else?" "I don't seem to have found the right kind of important hat." Poor Fergusson. Mrs. Possum, though, she was getting quite cross. She picked up the hat and snapped at Fergusson. Oh dear, they're not doing a very good job at talking to each other, are they? "Well, I've shown you all the important hats I have, and if none of them suit you, well, maybe you're not important." "Oh, but I am," said Fergusson, quite upset. "I just know I'm important." Just then, Mrs. Possum threw her arms in the air. Of course," she said, and raced out the back to a different cupboard. "I have one more hat," she called, returning with another large hat in her hand. Another cowboy hat? This is an Australian Akubra hat. "Oh, what fun, Fergusson!" "Bottle and gum!" exclaimed Fergusson. "It's just what I want," he said, grabbing the hat and putting it on. "Oh, what an important wombat you are, Fergusson," he cried as he stood before the mirror with a hat on his head. "I'll take this hat. Thank you, Mrs. Possum. It's a fine hat." With the hat firmly on his head, he left the shop singing. What fun! Would you like to know what he sang? He left the lyrics here for me, so I'll give it my best go. "What a good-looking wombat, Waddle and Stump. What a good-looking wombat you are. Waddle and Stump, you really are a star." Oh, what lovely words, Fergusson. And you really are all stars. I can't wait to read you the next letter. Bye-bye.